and today I am joined by my sister, Kiveli.
Hi.
And we are making a joint video because we will be talking about four-hand repertoire. We chose one piece that we are playing very soon in concert, actually in a couple of days, and it is by Ludwig van Beethoven, variations that he wrote on a theme that is called Ich denke dein, and he wrote a couple of variations for piano four hands, and we will be playing that, so we decided to make a little tutorial on things to look out for when playing piano four hands, important points, when you practice, when you're on stage, and we will be getting into all of that. Also, stay until the end of the video because we have a very big announcement at the end of the video that concerns us both. So if you're interested in hearing that, then make sure to watch the whole thing. So the first point is how we distribute the sound. And in our case, I usually play the upper part of the piano and Kiveli plays the lower part of the piano. So for me, it is always very important that I try to project very strongly into the hall, that I really make sure that these upper tones, which don't carry as much as the lower ones do, that they really get through that whole sound cloud that we are producing and really make it to the end of the hall.
And as the person playing in the lower part of the piano, it's actually quite paradox thing because the lower keys carry much easier, but you are usually the less important voice in terms of volume. I would say another thing that's very important is even within your lower voice to prioritize, of course, which voices are more important. And more often than not, I would say the most important voice is obviously Danae's melody carrying voice. And then next in line would be my bass, so my left hand, and then the right hand, which usually plays a more intricate figure of accompaniment, is the least important. So usually the more notes you have, the less important they are. And the more staying notes, the more permanent notes are the ones that kind of bring the depth that are important to stress. In piano four hands, the person who plays in the lower register is usually always also responsible for the pedal, which is absolutely its own art form and something that also took me a very long time to master, and I have to always be very, very mindful of, because obviously you're not just pedaling for your own voice, but you're also pedaling for a voice that you're not playing, which means that many times you have to go contrary to what would feel natural if you would play by yourself. For example, if Danae has a staccato figure and I have scale figures, if I would be playing by myself, I would usually try to keep like a constant pedaling around the scale figures to make it seem more together and harmonious. But I have to be very careful to never pedal in one of Danae's staccato figures. Otherwise, suddenly you would hear something very unnatural from Danae's voice, or from the perspective of Danae's voice.
So you really have to know the part of the other player very, very well, to the point that you could almost play it yourself so that you can pedal it correctly for the duo.
And very important, especially I would say in more romantic repertoire, where you get to places where really what is expected is that one voice sounds pedaled and one voice doesn't sound pedaled. And many times it's the lower voice that would sound pedaled, would need to sound pedaled, is really work with the entire range of the pedal, not just like pressing it or not pressing it, but half pressing it, quarter pressing it. Especially if you quarter press it, there are like some sweet spots where the lower part of the piano already is caught pedaled and the upper part of the piano not yet, or it's just more of an echo that sounds. So this kind of experimentation with the full range of the pedal is the most important tip I can give in terms of pedaling, especially in later, more romantic repertoire.
playing together, there are a couple of situations, especially when the piece gets into a more piano, lower volume register, where there is the danger there that the una corda pedal, which is the left pedal, might be used in situations where it doesn't really make sense to use it, especially concerning the upper voice. And it is a very strange feeling when playing together, because for me, for example, who is mostly only responsible for the melody and not really for the accompaniment, which usually in piano registers is more uncomfortable because you have more notes and have to get them all super silent. For me, it feels kind of natural to really refrain from using it quite a lot, because otherwise my melody is going to sound a bit muffled. I've made a couple of previous videos on pedaling and also una corda where I've mentioned this, and if you've watched them, you know that I'm not a fan of using una corda a lot. I always say use it really only when you want an actual color change and not when you want a dynamic change or a change in volume. So it really should be reserved for very special occasions. And when you play duo, it is important to always keep in mind what the melody is doing and not only focus on what might feel very right to use in the accompaniment for the una corda.
I would say that as the person actually in charge of not pressing it when the moment comes, obviously there are a few things to keep in mind. First of all is where you are. There are certain instruments or halls where it would make more or less sense to press it. Even if you, during the rehearsal session, decided, for example, to not press it, then you are in a hall, it's very echoey, the instrument is maybe particularly loud, and then you end up pressing it, obviously, or the other way around. But it is definitely a fact that many times you have to keep in mind that the melody, kind of the shining quality of the melody, has the priority, and you just have to really work on playing that piano volume just by yourself. However, one thing that I do find myself doing very often, also that we talk about, is using the una corda also not just as like a on or off kind of situation, but pressing it, for example, just for the resolution of a phrase, like keeping it not pressed the entire, and then for the resolution of a phrase where the melody itself also goes down, and then you have to go down even further as the accompaniment, using it for these very few special moments and almost like using it for singular notes rather than an entire phrase. When you play piano for hands, it has to be very clear in any given phrase what is the sound responsibility of mine and what is the sound responsibility of Danae's. More often than not, the allocation of responsibility is pretty clear. Danae's responsibility is to project and give that shining quality of the upper registers of the piano that can really reach into the last kind of audience member in the back of the hall. And my responsibility is, of course, to be present but carry in a different way. So I always find myself thinking I'm like kind of more the warmth, the support from underneath, and my role is to kind of provide that perfect little natural framework on which then the painting can be drawn musically.
I think what is important is for the person playing on the upper part to also kind of try to go into the sound that is being created from the bass. And we have one musical example that we're going to play now in a minute, where this is demonstrated, where Kiveli is playing kind of a carpet of harmony underneath, and it is important that I don't only project, but that I also sound-wise find myself getting into this bass that she has created. piano duo and especially piano for hands on one piano, so that excludes the whole repertoire for two pianos, it is, I think, the only form of chamber music that exists where you are sharing one instrument. No, there is no repertoire for two people playing one violin or anything like that. It only exists on the piano. And that is a very special situation because you are creating the sound from one tool, one piano, and it means that you really have to sound like one person. And what you would do when you would play solo and somehow create a sound commonly with two hands, you now have to do with two people and four hands. And this is why it is really important to know exactly what your piano partner sounds like, to know what kind of sound they produce, how they produce it, and really find your place within that sound. And this is why we also believe that it is very common for piano duos to be either siblings or married couples, because it really takes a lot of playing together to achieve this common sound. It is not the type of thing where you can meet at a festival and then just play together. Of course that exists, and of course sometimes there are amazing results, but to really have an actual amount of repertoire as a piano duo and sound good, it is, I think, comparable to, for example, a string quartet that also has to find a common sound. And this is why we also like to play piano duo, because we've been playing together basically for our entire lives, and it really takes that dedication also to have that common sound as a piano duo.
Another thing that, of course, is a very interesting element of when you play chamber music in general, but maybe it's extra intense when you play piano for hands, is the fact that you have to be in a constant dialogue with each other, and that many times when one person starts a phrase, the other person actually ends the phrase, ends that musical thought. So you have to kind of be able to finish a phrase in a way where in your mind you're actually continuing to play and phrase beyond your own notes. And that is, I think, one of the probably funnest parts also of playing piano duo, because those are the moments that usually end up getting the most spontaneity when you end up playing them on stage. Like the way maybe one of us would time the beginning of the phrase would, of course, then influence the way the other person would then time the ending of the phrase. And of course, those are the moments that when you know each other very well and you can trust that the other person is able to pick up on that spontaneous idea, you can then of course have so much fun with it and really try to also kind of coax out of each other a completely new way of looking at that phrase in that moment, which then creates, of course, a very nice dimension to the performance.
And when you're practicing at first, it might feel a little bit unnatural to, when your phrase ends, to not have it actually end like it would if you were just practicing a solo piece. So even if it feels unnatural, don't be worried about that. The piece will only be complete when playing it with your partner. And it is more important to create one common phrase than for you to feel comfortable when practicing it alone. So sometimes when we practice separately, it feels very strange because we kind of stop in the middle of the phrase full of tension. There's no resolving feeling, but this is because the other one then has that resolving feeling.
And actually, I don't know if you remember, we used to do this many years ago when we used to practice duo and even two pianos, where we would have this thing where we would say, okay, I'm going to play this phrase in 5 different ways, and depending on how I play, you're going to react to it. And it always was like a game. For example, when it was about dynamics, 3 phrases, are we going to play it in a crescendo, in a diminuendo, in a like 2-1-3? So what we would do is always like a game. Danae, let's say, would decide, okay, today I'm going to play it with a diminuendo, you're going to have to react to it. So you can really also get into a playful mindset with these things.
Another interesting aspect about playing piano for hands is the space. There is not a lot of space. You're sitting next to each other, bodies touching at the piano, and also your hands are touching and your fingers very often get in the way of each other. And I think there is no piece where there is not at least one of these situations where either my hand or Kiveli's hand is in the way of the other one playing. And very often I have to put in my score, take away that finger, or maybe actually I have to let go of one legato in order to lift that note so that Kiveli can play because she has the melody with it. So there are tons of situations like this one. And in this Beethoven piece that we chose for you today, right in the beginning, if Kiveli would play her voice as she would normally play it, fingering wise and hand position wise, I wouldn't even be able to play my first note. So we recorded what this would be like. And as you can see, the solution is for her to lift her hand up in a kind of a natural way, actually, and for me to go underneath and play that first note, and then for her to slowly go back into the normal playing position. This kind of situation is very normal in piano duo, so you always just have to be open to finding solutions of how you're going to position your hands in order to accommodate the other person.
I think that usually there are like one of three scenarios, if it's not like one of the pieces where literally you have to cross hands, which also happens sometimes, but there is one of three scenarios that you need to go for. And always when we play through a piece for the first time, we have to write them down in our score. Okay, the first one is what you just mentioned with the hand position, like one person plays from the top or the one person plays from the bottom, and you have to decide what makes more sense, usually depending on whether someone plays black keys or white keys is what it comes down to. The second thing is actually having to go against what's in the score, what you mentioned with the legatos and things like that, or maybe a note that is written in the score as a quarter note, you have to then suddenly play it as a quaver note, because you know, in the second quaver, suddenly the other person has a melody, so you actually have to go against what's in the notes to make it possible. And the third thing is that you have to choose your fingering not just according to what feels the most comfortable, but also what makes sense in comfort with the other person. For example, many times if I have an accompaniment figure, of course I would usually use my, I would say, quote unquote dominant fingers, the first, the second, and the third, and I would kind of play it with these fingers. However, if Danae is a melody very close to my accompaniment, I'm gonna have to play the accompaniment with my third, fourth, and fifth finger, which is less comfortable, I would say, and less natural. However, I have to do it because otherwise my third, fourth, and fifth finger are just constantly in the way and she can't play comfortably. So this is like a classic example that happens many, many times.
I think the number one thing that people practice when playing piano duo
and worry about
or play anything with another musician is being together. Not just having the same pulse and being together throughout the piece, but especially starting together, being together in the rubati, in the ritardandos where there is no clear pulse, and those kind of moments where you can't really explain it, you can't really count it, you just have to feel it. And very often this is labeled breathing together. Breathe together with your musical partner, and I think there is some truth to that. For sure, it is the most common thing is to kind of show. There is this thing that either Kiveli or I, depending on the situation, show when to start. But even that showing can be so different from person to person. It can be an entire bar, it can be a beat, it can just be a feeling. So you really have to know, once again, your partner, really feel what they mean. And this comes over time. In the beginning, I think we completely didn't know, of course, what the other one meant when doing that. And now we are at a point, after playing together for years and years and years, we're at a point where we can almost just place the hands on the piano and more or less start together.
I think there are two kind of important elements that I have found I had to kind of move towards. The first thing is that it is very enticing in piano for hands because you can actually see the other person, to try to look at their hands and when they're going to press the keys, and then kind of, instead of listening to when they play, look at when they play and then try to be together that way. And that is not a good strategy. I find that many times, because two reasons. One is a psychological reason, because then you're kind of getting more into, I would say, panic mode. Okay, I'm going to see exactly when they play, and panic mode is never conducive to good music making. And the second thing is because simply it's not a good way to get your information from, because there is also the speed with which you press the key and everything. So it seems easier, it isn't. So it's always easier to really focus on listening to each other. And then when it comes to these like kind of intangible magical qualities, feeling, for example, in the end of a slow movement when to play the resolution together, you have to do it again and again and again. And it's the most important element is this element of trust, that at some point you know that if you just focus on really listening to how the sound develops, it's gonna be together. It's really difficult to explain, because at some point it's just this feeling, this like kind of gut feeling of, I know when the note's gonna come, and that's when you play it. And the moment you get out of that and you start kind of second guessing yourself, those are the moments where it ends up not being together.
And I think the trust thing is very important, because it's also very dangerous to wait for each other.
Oh yeah.
Because don't go into that thing where you wait for each other and you kind of wait for that beginning of the sound and then quickly add in your note, because that never works. You're never together. You really have to take that leap of faith, and if you believe the note's coming now, place your note as well.
Yeah.
And that's going to be better than waiting and then being completely apart.
Yeah. Another thing that, of course, for piano duos like us, that for example live together, is something that we have to think about, is whether we practice separately or whether we practice together immediately. And definitely, like in any other form of chamber music where you meet for rehearsals, it is very important to first practice by yourself. For many reasons. First of all, not just to learn the notes and be able to kind of technically master your part, but also you first have to get to know your part very well and feel so comfortable in it that then when the other person comes in, you can actually focus primarily on the other person's part rather than your own part. That's when you can actually start to have a quality interpretation together. I imagine it's like almost, I don't know, like an actor who first has to know their part very well, so that when then they get into the scene with the other person, they don't have to constantly think about their next line, but they can react to the way the other person says their line. And of course, that is the point you want to get to then find a common language within that piece.
Having said that, of course, you can read through the piece once together with your partner to just get an idea, to know what we were saying before, where those phrases go, if there are any musical surprises coming from the other side. But then, of course, get to know the piece by yourself before you get into that duo practice, which has its whole own set of challenges. So these were our tips for playing piano for hands as a longtime piano duo that we are. We really hope you found this interesting. And now before we end this video, here is our big announcement and surprise. We are starting a podcast together. It's called The Sister Trill, and I'm going to link the channel down below. You can listen to it anywhere that you are listening to podcasts. You can also watch it on YouTube. And the first episode is going live on Saturday, which is the 3rd of July.
The podcast is going to be a lot about our lives as sisters, and as sisters who are both in the same business and in the same social circles, about our relationship, how we cultivated our relationship now, how we used to be like with each other when we were kids and teenagers, going through music studies and master classes and playing concerts together, navigating our lives in, as I said, the same business, knowing the same people, sometimes trying to kind of go for the same chances to advance our careers. So it's very much about that aspect of our lives. Also, of course, our personal lives.
Yes, it's very personal, so much more personal than what you see on this channel. So sometimes I get very personal comments and questions, and I never really get into them here, but on the podcast we are going to be getting deeply into those ones. So if you're interested in seeing this more personal approach, very much more behind the scenes of our lives as sisters, musicians, and everything that goes with that, then definitely tune in. You can head over and subscribe to the channel now already. As I said, the first episode is going live on Saturday, or just listen to it on all the other platforms. We're very excited about this, and we hope that you will tune in. And other than that, I'll see you again on the next video on this channel next Tuesday. Bye.
Bye.
You're listening to The Sister Trill with Danae and Kiveli.